Well, hello. Slightly different video today. I was asked to take a look at a motorcycle for somebody. The one behind me here, actually, and I'll talk a little bit about what it is in a second. But I thought I'd do a quick video. If you're like me, I'm really cheap. No two ways about it. I try to save money wherever I can. Very wise, I should say, or very frugal with my expenditures. So this particular bike is offered for sale, and I was asked to take a look at it to sort of give my sort of opinion as to the mechanical condition, the aesthetic condition, any other kind of insight I could give on to a potential buyer. So I thought it'd be a great video or a great subject matter to cover off on a video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of the steps. I'll talk first of all about what this is, and then I'll talk about some of the steps I go through in assessing whether or not, objectively assessing whether or not a motorcycle would be a good purchase, or some of the potential pitfalls about buying used bikes. This particular bike is 22 years old actually this year, so it doesn't look actually that bad, but I'll go through some of the things I've noticed about it and some of the things, some of the processes I go through when assessing whether or not a bike is typically worth my time or worth somebody else's time, or at the very least provide them with the information and they can make the assessment whether or not it's worth their time. They might have some kind of emotional attachment to a model or not. That's up to them, but I can tell them what I suspect is going to need to be repaired or replaced or modified. Watch along. Now, this particular bike, if you are an enthusiast at all about Japanese sport bikes, this particular bike is a homologation special. It's a 1992 ZX7R. Most of us who owned these bikes back in the early 90s bought the ZX7. It looks almost identical to this, but there's some subtle differences. This particular one is a ZX7R, and the main things to help you spot that I'll go through in just a second. Now here is the serial number, and you notice I'm pointing to the N. The N denotes the year, model year. Up above here, this points out to when it was manufactured. November of 91. So typically, from August and September on in a given year, most manufacturers are moving off to the next model year, and that's the case here. So this here is an N right here, and that means that's the 10th digit in there, and that means N denotes 1992 model year. This K down here in ZX750K, the K stands for the particular model and a submodel of the ZX750. The K is the homologation special. There's only 170 or 165 or 170 of these that made into North America, and I think only about 10 or 12 that made it to Canada. So this baby is very rare. If you have seen a lot of carburetors in your time, you'll notice these strange looking things. These are flat slide carburetors. There's no primary and secondary venturi action. It's all primary on your wrist. In other words, when you crank your wrist, you open up gates that allows the air to go immediately in. On a conventional CV carburetor, which are circular, what you do is you open up a passage to air, which increases the vacuum, which in turn raises the slide through the vacuum that you create, as opposed to actuating the slide directly with your wrist. The advantage to these carburetors are they are much more tunable for racing purposes. And if you develop good throttle control with your wrist, these are preferable to CV carburetors because they're at partial throttle, they're much more responsive, or I find they're much more responsive. They are very, very expensive. This bank of carburetors is probably worth about $3,500 new, which is about twice the price of a set of CV carburetors. Anyway, this is the biggest giveaway on this bike, and this is probably one of the most notable features on this bike, of this bank of carburetors. Another aspect of this bike is a much more aggressive camshaft profile, which develops more power than the standard 7. Here's another giveaway of the model. The K model, the R model, came with this adjustable shock, which is really high-end, very expensive. And the aluminum fuel tank, $2,000 here in Canada. And a mile away, the solo seat made of hand-laid fiberglass. Very, very expensive tail section. So you can see this here. This is safety wire. This is required by racing tracks. And it's an obvious sign, very, very obvious sign. This bike was at the track for, at the very least, a full day. Now, most or some of the racing clubs around will allow you to run your bike, your street bike, without putting safety wire on it if you're just doing track sessions. But typically, if you do more than 3 or 4 track sessions, you would wire it, okay? In other words, you're doing a full day, which means this thing clearly spent some time at the track. That's not necessarily a bad thing. This particular race model was built for the track, so that doesn't make the bike worth less, but it does point out that this has spent some time at the track, and it warrants further evaluation. Here in Canada, Hindle Exhaust is a very popular exhaust manufacturer, and you can see here the prior owner has installed one, stainless steel. Those tiny rust spots, those are just those actually should polish right out. So this is a really nice exhaust, probably worth a lot of money, and it was worth a lot of money when it was new, and that's a good sign because that just shows the money that one of the prior owners put into this thing. Now, as you can see, one of the owners, and I'm not sure if it's a prior owner, they're 2 owners ago, and I'm not sure how many owners this bike has had, but they've installed this tank bra. These are expensive. They're worth about $100 each, but it's a nasty trick that some owners use to hide damage to the tank underneath. Sometimes there's a dent or a scratch, so they put one of those bras on to hide it. In this case, the tank's fine. It was just put on for looks and for protection, so no problem there. Another sign of track exposure, frequently these body screws go missing. In this case, this whole tail section is missing all of its screws. It's only being held on by the seat. Somebody clearly waxed it and touched the seat with some wax. That's really tough to get off, but I think I'll be able to. And then take a look at this. The tail section in this particular bike was very expensive. It was actually made of fiberglass at the factory, whereas most plastic is normally made of ABS. This bodywork is actually made of fiberglass, and as such, it's very, very expensive. And when they're damaged, they're very rarely repaired or replaced. They're very, very rarely replaced with stock pieces. So most people will replace them with aftermarket bodywork. In this case, it's still fiberglass. Now, looking back here, this is clearly an aftermarket blinker. The indicator that's on this bike was actually on a stock, and it was actually a running light. So I'm assuming this here cable that's being unused, this plug, ran the running light, and somebody found these here blinkers somewhere and just put them on temporarily. And they've actually didn't even use the proper bolts and nuts. They've used something and then put a little silicone as a Loctite to prevent them from falling out. So those should be replaced in order to bring this closer back to what it was. Other than that, things don't look too bad down here. You can notice in the 90s, especially with these narrow purpose bikes, there wasn't a lot of covering here, and they're actually quite Spartan looking, which is appealing in its own right. Here's a big giveaway on whether or not a bike's been in an accident, or let me rephrase, whether a bike's been in an accident and repaired on the cheap. This bike may have been in an accident. I don't know for sure yet. It doesn't appear to have been in one. And one of the giveaways is these here frame stays. Typically what happens is when a bike gets into an accident, these frame stays get bent or twisted. The minute they do, they peel off all this special coating, which is not normal paint. Because of the chromoly material, or what this hard steel material that these frames are made out of, these stays, the paint tends not to stick well to them. So the kind of paint that the manufacturers use tends to act more as a coating as opposed to adhering directly to the surface. So the minute that substrate gets bent or twisted or cocked off in one way, this paint tends to peel right off because its surface gets torn and it peels right off. So a good giveaway of whether or not a bike's been in an accident and then these frames have been restraightened, because they're fairly expensive, is if you see that coating peeled off or spray bombed a different color. Now this bike appears to have 18,000 kilometers on it. I don't know if that number's accurate. If it is accurate, it's very good, very low mileage, which is about slightly over 10,000 miles. If that's the case, that's great. But since this bike has seen the track, or I believe pretty darn near 100% it's seen the track, there's a good chance that the speedometer was unhooked for some of that track time, which is common to do. And in this case, that would mean that this 18,000 is reading low. Another sign as to whether or not a bike's been in an accident is any repairs or scratches on the engine cases down here. Sometimes people will find replacement bodywork, but these here pieces are more expensive and much more involved to repair and replace. So I know for a fact this sort of gunmetal metallic is the stock color from Kawasaki, and doesn't appear to be any scratches on this guard on this side, or this case on this side, so I'm assuming this bike has never been down. Or, if it has been down, whoever replaced it spent a lot of money to do it right. On the other side, another sign that this bike probably has never been down, or this bodywork is stock, is that it still has this insulation glued on the inside of it. And usually, if there's been a repair, this stuff gets peeled off, the plastic is repaired and repainted, and people don't bother spending the money, especially on a track bike, to put this insulation back on. Another good sign this bike hasn't been down. Back tires very low. That'll have to be replaced, but that's perfectly normal on any used bike. Now this is a very unpleasant surprise. This is bad fuel, old fuel residue that's built up on the inside lining of the tank. Now, very fortunately, just by the luck of the draw, if you can see that shiny gray piece down the middle, this tank is made of aluminum. And because of that, you're not going to get the rust issues. As you can see, these here two screws here have both rusted quite dramatically from the moisture that the fuel, or the ethanol, I'm assuming in the fuel, absorbed and caused this this gooey stuff to build up. It's gritty, soft, but now this will have to be cleaned out. This tank, this bike is quite honestly is not worth much without it. This tank, because to replace this tank, I mean, this particular bike is probably $1,800 or $1,900, so not worth replacing on a bike this old, unfortunately, unless you're really mad about the model. Here's another pet peeve of mine. If you're going to cut the fender, put an appropriate kit in that stores the blinkers outside of the body. These open cuts like this cause water and all sorts of debris to fly up in along the edges here, and these here blinkers are going to take damage off this tire. These should be outside of this well. Another pleasant surprise is to see the airbox still intact on bikes. One thing I've learned in all my years of wrenching is that unless you have a bike throttle wide open, the most of the time you're riding it, a conventional stock airbox is always the way to go. The engineers with Kawasaki spent a whole truckload of time and a lot of time and research developing an airbox. And when you take these off and replace it with individual air filters, you really mess up the equilibrium they created on the drafting table. So I always recommend, if you're looking at buying a used bike, unless you really know what you're doing, I would avoid staying away from carburetors with individual air filters as opposed to a stock airbox, if you're driving it on the street. If you're driving it on a drag track, or well, primarily a drag racing track, then you can get away with individual filters, but this is the way to go. Now at first glance, the underside of this side cover, almost into the belly of the bike, you notice this scratch that runs across. And initially you think, well, it's just a scratch. But if you look close, you can see some puddling of the plastic here. And what's happened, I suspect, is that this bike was backed off a trailer, and the ramp was so steep it caused the ramp to catch the belly of the bike and crack this here, caused flexing up here, which cracked the side of the fairing. And this in turn was repaired. And if I look over at the other side here, I have a similar sort of thing here with some scratching where it probably hit the ramp here, here, and here, and then this here scratch on the side. Well, this, if you look very closely, is puddling of the ABS, and that was clearly a repair. And if I flip it over, you can see that's exactly the case. So once again, nothing to worry about. This happens actually to all sorts of bikes that are put on the back of cars or back of trailers or trucks, and you really got to be careful about how steep the ramp is. As you can see here, the left side fork stanchion here is it's covered in oil. So what it is this, in behind this dust cap up in here, there's an oil seal for the oil on the slider, or rather on the stanchion. So what's happening is that just over time, probably the rubber in there is deteriorated and allow oil to seep down. Not a huge problem. You don't want it around this area, down in the brakes or anything like that. You don't want it on the wheel because it tends to get messy. And it's one of those things you got to clean up, and it's better to take care of it and do a repair. Doing a repair is not involved, not too terribly involved. It requires supporting the bike, pulling out this here fork tube, flipping it over, drawing out the seal, and then pounding in a new one. And I have a kit to do that, a tool rather to do that. Now, the story here was that this bike has sat for a few years without even moving, and that would support that. Even though this chain looked like it was at one point well lubed, see rust on the rollers. What's happened is it was lubed and then driven significantly before being relubed. So the plates are still black with a lot of lubricant on them, but the rollers, after running dry off the sprockets, had the lubricant wiped off, then they rust. This will have to be replaced along with the two sprockets. Frequently, track bikes have sprockets that use different sizes than stock, so it's usually a good idea to take a look at replacing them anyway, because quite often they're not serviceable on the street. Also, you'll notice has what we call rear sets or fold away or lightweight pegs. These are really a requirement on the track. The stock pegs sit down to about here, and that extra length actually reduces the clearance on the bike on a lean, so you want those short, tight, and close up into the bike. And there's our initial inspection. Stay tuned for part 2, where we look a little deeper into the guts of the bike to see how it's looking there from a health standpoint.